Outgoing NATO Secretary General takes a swipe at the U.S. administration. Disagreements over the direction of the Ukraine war. NATO and European Union countries are currently debating Ukraine's request to use donated weapons to attack targets within Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron has been the highest profile leader calling for this, and he appears to have support from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron. Outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg weighed in on the issue this month, agreeing that NATO countries that donate weapons to Ukraine should not face restrictions and should be free to attack targets within Russia if Ukraine chooses to do so. Mr. Stoltenberg has also provided his opinion, as he is close to the end of his term and is freer to speak, and he is taking this moment to publicly criticize Ukraine policy of the U.S. administration. Mr. Stoltenberg criticizes U.S. President Joe Biden for opposing the use of donated U.S. weapon systems and any other donated weapon to attack targets within Russia's borders. President Biden and his National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan are concerned that allowing the use of U.S. and Western weapons against Russian targets will risk escalation of the war. Russian politicians and allies of Russian President Vladimir Putin have stated that attacks on Russia by Western weapons would serve as justification for the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and against the countries that supplied them. This threat, along with several nuclear drills held by Russia, has caused the White House to take a cautious approach. Consequently, the U.S. has imposed stipulations on the conduct of the war. Given that the U.S. currently donates the largest quantity of military aid to Ukraine, it holds a significant influence over the use of Western weapons for attacking Russian territory and the conduct of the war by Ukraine. Mr. Stoltenberg is clearly growing impatient with the U.S. administration's cautious approach and micromanagement of the war. NATO countries pushed Biden to allow the donation of ATACMS, F-16s, M1 Abrams battle tanks, which he eventually agreed to, but only after intense pressure from NATO leadership and member countries. Stoltenberg and other European leaders have expressed frustration over the U.S. administration's divided stance on the use of weapon systems. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin are in favor of allowing a freer use of U.S. and Western donated weapon systems. President Biden and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan are cautious, intent on keeping the war contained and managed, and do not want to risk escalation by allowing Western weapons to attack targets within Russia. Therefore, even though the president has made his position publicly known, the factions discussing issues with Western partners have the power to water it down. The problem with the Biden-Sullivan approach is that it clearly outlines the restrictions and communicates them to the Russians. This has enabled the Russians to understand the restrictions and adjust their military strategy accordingly by establishing safe havens within Russia's borders. The administration strategy employs micromanagement style of warfare, a departure from an alignment from the Lyndon B. Johnson administration's handling of the war from the White House. Johnson's war management was also prevented attacks on safe havens in Cambodia and Laos, enabling North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces to conduct operations in South Vietnam from these safe havens. The current administration has renewed this practice. Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin are generally in disagreement with the Biden-Sullivan approach. Secretary Austin, a product of the post-Vietnam U.S. military, has a predisposition not to allow the mistakes of the Vietnam War to happen again, and once the political decision is made, the military decides how best to accomplish the goal. This is the theory, and it breaks down if there is political manipulation of the conduct of war, and it can be successful in avoiding the type of war strategy that Lyndon Johnson enacted. Secretary Blinken comes to the same conclusion as Secretary Austin, but arrives from a different location or different direction. Blinken is no Henry Kissinger and is willing to defer to the European position so as to create consensus with the United States and its allies, instead of providing clear U.S. leadership. When discussing policy in public, the two most powerful cabinet officials are not in public rebellion with the administration, but they are not hiding it either. So the split in the White House is not behind closed doors and is well known to the world, including the Russians. Secretary General Stoltenberg, who publicly disagrees with the U.S. president and aligns himself with the Blinken-Austin faction of the U.S. administration, clearly understands that international pressure can manipulate U.S. policy that can be destabilizing. The destabilizing aspect of this lack of leadership and Vietnam War-style policy is that under sufficient pressure, Biden has conceded to the donation of ATACMS, then M1 tanks, and finally F-16s. The White House's inflexible positions are ultimately flexible when pressure is applied, allowing them to concede on weapon systems that were previously and firmly restricted from Ukraine, but now have been sent and on differing timelines, with the exception of F-16s, which is currently ongoing training. The destabilizing factor is that the administration, rather than adopting a position of strategic ambiguity to keep the Russians guessing what the U.S. and its allies will do, has publicly stated clearly defined limits. However, with the correct amount of pressure, the administration will relent, change its policies on weapons, and then still attempt to manage the war from the White House. This implies that any policy, regardless of how strongly argued, is susceptible to change. Strategic ambiguity leaves Russia uncertain about U.S. actions, thereby necessitating a degree of self-discipline as Russia struggles to discern whether it will be crossing a boundary. The White House's current approach involves policies that articulate rules which can change when public pressure intensifies. This may seem like a difference without a distinction, but the subtle nature of it is what makes it the two important differences. Strategic ambiguity leaves one party uncertain about the boundaries and can be difficult to counter without resorting to escalation or threats, as there is no explicit policy in place. Threats can counteract public red lines that are subject to change without notice by issuing counter red lines against any policy changes, therefore forcing them to remain unchanged. The U.S. administration, though it has told Ukraine that it can attack Russia using its domestically manufactured weapons, has requested that Ukraine refrain from attacking Russian oil and gas infrastructure. The goal of this policy is to prevent disruptions in the supply of oil and gas to the global market, as the sanctions on Russian energy trade aim to more annoy Russia, such as setting price caps, but not to eliminate the oil and gas from the market. Domestic politics in the United States are most likely the reason for the porous sanction process, which is not a loophole to the sanctions, but an intentional feature. The U.S. administration's position contrasts with the direction of the Europeans are going under the leadership of President Macron and Secretary General Stoltenberg, who are both receiving sympathetic support from Antony Blinken. The Europeans become frustrated when their arguments seem to be accepted by the administration, leading them to make progress in changing U.S. policy regarding a weapon system to be donated to Ukraine. However, the administration fails to apply the same logic to the other weapon systems that the Europeans turn around have to convince the administration again. Mr. Stoltenberg and his European allies are striving to establish a 100 billion euro fund that is immune to the political whims of either European Union or United States. This would enable the Ukrainians to depend on aid for their war effort unaffected by the results of European and American elections. This would also eliminate the U.S. administration's micromanagement of the war effort, provided they agree to remove the restrictions on the use of donated weapons and the types of weapons that can be donated. It is unusual for the NATO Secretary General to be so publicly opposed to the war with its largest and most powerful member state. It is a byproduct of a confused and divided administration whose apparently only principal commitment is to follow a proven failed policy strategy that has not been used since the Vietnam War. Those principles are subject to change if enough political pressure is applied. Even making exceptions will create diplomatic confusion and greater global instability. The challenge for Stoltenberg is the open question of whether he even has authority to do what he's attempting. Budgetary decisions and decisions to use military force ultimately fall on the member states, not NATO. Macron supports working within the European Union framework, which is part of his current crusade to reshape the EU. Germany prefers to work within the framework of the funds they have set aside in their budget to support Ukraine. This means that German aid is not subject to EU unanimous consent, putting it outside of both Stoltenberg's and Macron's vision. However, the biggest obstacle is the U.S. administration's cautious approach to the war, which restricts strikes on Russian territory, lacks appropriate deterrence strategies, and allows Russia to continue selling its primary commodity to fund its war. While the adopted approach to supporting the Ukraine in its war is flawed, it is not Stoltenberg's or NATO's duty to rectify it, despite its contentious nature.